No, page 27 is where we were at. So, what's the story, Harry? Said Ron impatiently. What's been happening? Harry told them all about Dobby, the warning he'd given Harry, and the fiasco of the violet pudding. There was a long, shocked silence when he had finished. Very fishy, said Fred finally. Definitely dodgy, agreed George. So he wouldn't even tell you who's supposed to be plotting all this stuff. I don't think he could, said Harry. I told you every time he got close to letting something slip, he started banging his head against the wall. He saw Fred and George look at each other. What, you think he was lying to me? Said Harry. Well, said Fred, put it this way. House elves have got powerful magic of their own, but they can't usually use it without their master's permission. I reckon old Dobby was sent to stop you coming back to Hogwarts. Someone's idea of a joke. Can you think of anyone at school with a grudge against you? Yes, said Harry and Ron together instantly. Draco Malfoy, Harry explained. He hates me. Draco Malfoy, said George, turning round. Not Lucius Malfoy's son. Must be. It's not a very common name, is it? Said Harry. Why? I've heard Dad talking about him, said George. He was a big supporter of you-know-who. And when you-know-who disappeared, said Fred, craning around to look at Harry, Lucius Malfoy came back saying he'd never meant any of it. Load of dung. Dad reckons he was right in you-know-who's inner circle. Harry had heard these rumors about Malfoy's family before, and they didn't surprise him at all. Draco Malfoy made Dudley Dursley look like a kind, thoughtful, and sensitive boy. I don't know whether the Malfoys owns house elf, said Harry. Well, whoever owns him will be an old wizarding family, and they'll be rich, said Fred. Yeah, Mom's always wishing we had a house elf to do the ironing, said George. But all we've got is a lousy old ghoul in the attic. And gnomes all over the garden. House elves come with big old manors and castles and places like that. You wouldn't catch one in our house. Harry was silent. Judging by the fact that Draco Malfoy usually had the best of everything, his family was rolling in wizard gold. He could just see Malfoy strutting around a large manor house. Sending the family servant to stop Harry going back to Hogwarts also sounded exactly like the sort of thing Malfoy would do. Had Harry been stupid to take Dobby seriously? I'm glad we came to get you anyway, said Ron. I was getting really worried when you didn't answer any of my letters. I thought it was Errol's fault at first. Who's Errol? Our owl. He's ancient. It wouldn't be the first time he'd collapsed on delivery. So then I tried to borrow Herm's. Who? The owl Mom and Dad bought Percy when he was made a prefect, said Fred from the front. But Percy wouldn't lend him to me, said Ron. Said he needed him. Percy's been acting very oddly this summer, said George, frowning. And he has been sending a lot of letters and spending a load of time shut up in his room. I mean, there's only so many times you can polish a prefect badge. You're driving too far west, Fred, he added, pointing at the compass on the dashboard. Fred twiddled the steering wheel. So, does your dad know you got the car? Said Harry, guessing the answer. No, said Ron. He had to work tonight. Hopefully we'll be able to get it back in the garage without Mom noticing we flew it. What does your dad do at the Ministry of Magic anyway? He works in the most boring department, said Ron. The Misuse of Muggle Artifacts office? The what? It's all to do with bewitching things that are Muggle-made. You know, in case they end up back in a Muggle shop or house. Like last year, some old witch died and a tea set was sold to an antique shop. This Muggle woman bought it, took it home, and tried to serve her friends tea in it. It was a nightmare. Dad was working overtime for weeks. What happened? The teapot went berserk and squirted boiling tea all over the place, and one man ended up in hospital with sugar tongs clamped to his nose. Dad was going frantic. It's only him and an old warlock called Perkins in the office. They had to do memory charms and all sorts to cover it up. But your dad, this car? Fred laughed. Yeah, Dad's mad about everything to do with Muggles. Our shed's full with Muggle stuff. He takes it apart, puts spells on it, and puts it back together again. If he raided our house, he'd have to put himself straight under arrest. It drives Mom mad. That's the main road, said George, peering down through the windscreen. We'll be there in 10 minutes. Just as well, it's getting light. A faint, pinkish glow was visible along the horizon of the east. Fred brought the car lower and Harry saw a dark patchwork of fields and clumps of trees. We're a little way outside of the village, said George. Ottery St. Catchpole. Lower and lower went the flying car. The edge of a brilliant red sun was now gleaming through the trees. Touchdown, said Fred, as with a slight bump they hit the ground. They had landed next to a tumble-down garage in a small yard, and Harry looked out for the first time at Ron's house. It looked as though it had once been a large stone pigsty, but extra rooms had been added here and there until it was several stories high, and so crooked it looked as though it was held up by magic, which Harry reminded himself it probably was. 4 or 5 chimneys were perched on top of the red roof. A lopsided sign stuck in the ground near the entrance read, The Burrow. Round the front door lay a jumble of Wellington boots and a very rusty cauldron. Several fat brown chickens were pecking their way around the yard. It's not much, said Ron. It's brilliant, said Harry happily, thinking of Privet Drive. They got out of the car. Now we'll go upstairs really quietly, said Fred, and wait for Mom to call us for breakfast. Then, Ron, you come bounding downstairs going, Mom, look who turned up in the night. And she'll be all pleased to see Harry and no one ever know we flew the car. Right, said Ron. Come, Harry, I sleep at the... Ron had gone a nasty greenish color, his eyes fixed on the house. The other 3 wheeled around. Mrs. Weasley was marching across the yard, scattering chickens, and for a short, plump, kind-faced woman, it was remarkable how much she looked like a saber-toothed tiger. Ah, said Fred. Oh dear, said George. Mrs. Weasley came to a halt in front of them, her hands on her hips, staring from one guilty face to the next. She was wearing a flowered apron with a wand sticking out of the pocket. So, she said. Morning, Mum, said George in what he clearly thought was a jaunty, winning voice. Have you any idea how worried I've been? Said Mrs. Weasley in a deadly whisper. Sorry, Mum, but see, we had to... All 3 of Mrs. Weasley's sons were taller than she was, but they cowered as her rage broke over them. Bed's empty, no note, caught a gun, could have crashed, out of my mind with worry, did you care? Never, as long as I've lived. You wait until your father gets home. We never had trouble like this from Bill or Charlie or Percy. Perfect, Percy, muttered Fred. You could do with taking a leaf out of Percy's book, yelled Mrs. Weasley, prodding a finger in Fred's chest. You could have died. You could have been seen. You could have lost your father his job. It seemed to go on for hours. Mrs. Weasley had shouted herself hoarse before she turned on Harry, who backed away. I'm very pleased to see you, Harry dear, she added. Come in and have some breakfast. She turned and walked back into the house, and Harry, after a nervous glance at Ron, who nodded encouragingly, followed her. The kitchen was small and rather cramped. There was a scrubbed wooden table and chairs in the middle, and Harry sat down on the edge of his seat, looking around. He had never been in a wizard house before. The clock on the wall opposite him had only 1 hand and no numbers at all. Written around the edge were things like time to make tea, time to feed the chickens, and you're late. Books were stacked 3 deep on the mantelpiece. Books with titles like Charm Your Own Cheese, Enchantment in Baking, and 1-Minute Feasts. It's magic! And unless Harry's ears were deceiving him, the old radio next to the sink had just announced that coming up was Witching Hour with the popular singing sorceress Celestina Warbeck. Mrs. Weasley was clattering around, cooking breakfast a little haphazardly, throwing dirty looks at her sons as she threw sausages into the frying pan. Every now and then she muttered things like, "Don't know what you were thinking of, and never would have believed." I don't blame you, dear, she assured Harry, tipping 8 or 9 sausages onto the plate. Arthur and I have been worried about you too. Just last night we were saying we'd come and get you ourselves if you hadn't written back to Ron by Friday. But really..." She was now adding 3 fried eggs to his plate. "Flying an illegal car halfway across the country? Anyone could have seen you." She flicked her wand casually at the washing up in the sink, which began to clean itself, clinking gently in the background. "It was cloudy, Mom," said Fred. "You keep your mouth closed while you're eating," Mrs. Weasley snapped. "They were starving him, Mom," said George. "And you," said Mrs. Weasley, but it was a slightly softened expression that she started cutting Harry bread and buttering it for him. At the moment, there was a diversion in the form of a small red-headed figure in a long nightdress, who appeared in the kitchen, gave a small squeal, and ran out again. "Yeah, she'll be wanting your autograph, Harry," grinned Fred. But he caught his mother's eye and bent his face over his plate without another word. Nothing more was said until all 4 plates were clean, which took a surprisingly short time. "Blimey, I'm tired," yawned Fred, setting down his knife and fork at last. "I think I'll go to bed then." "You will not," snapped Mrs. Weasley. "It's your own fault you've been up all night. You're going to de-gnome the garden for me. They're getting completely out of hand again." "Oh, Mom." "And you too," she said, glaring at Ron and George. "You can go up to bed there," she added to Harry. "You didn't ask them to fly that wretched car." But Harry, who felt wide awake, said quickly, "I'll help Ron. I've never seen a de-gnoming." "That's very sweet of you, dear, but it's dull work," said Mrs. Weasley. "Now let's see what Lockhart has got to say on the subject." And she pulled a heavy book from the stack on the mantelpiece. George groaned. "Mom, we know how to de-gnome a garden." Harry looked at the cover of Mrs. Weasley's book. Written across it in fancy gold letters were the words "Gilderoy Lockhart's Guide to Household Pests." There was a big photograph on the front of a very good-looking wizard with wavy blonde hair and bright blue eyes. As always in the wizarding world, the photograph was moving. The wizard, who Harry supposed was Gilderoy Lockhart, kept winking cheekily up at them. Mrs. Weasley beamed down at him. "Oh, he is marvelous," she said. "He knows his household pests all right. It's a wonderful book." "Mom fancies him," said Fred in a very audible whisper. "Don't be so ridiculous, Fred," said Mrs. Weasley, her cheeks rather pink. "All right, if you think you know better than Lockhart, you can go and get on with it. And woe betide you if there's a single gnome in that garden when I come out to inspect it." Yawning and grumbling, the Weasleys slouched outside with Harry behind them. The garden was large, and in Harry's eyes, exactly what a garden should be. The Dursleys wouldn't have liked it. There were plenty of weeds and the grass needed cutting, but there were gnarled trees all around the walls. Plants Harry had never seen spilling from every flower bed, and a big green pond full of frogs. And that's where we'll end it today, guys. Thank you so much for joining